There is a specific kind of knowledge that never makes it into the official park ranger handbooks. It's not written in the glossy brochures handed out to tourists at the front gates, nor is it mentioned during the standard wilderness first aid certifications or the wildlife management seminars. It is a piece of lore passed down entirely in whispers. You only hear about it during your first week on the job, usually long after the civilian staff have gone home, inside a cramped, dimly lit break room that smells permanently of stale pine sap, damp wool, and creeping mildew. The veterans, men with skin like cured leather and eyes that have spent too many decades staring into the dark, call it the rule of 3. They deliver it to you casually, usually over a mug of black coffee so bitter it tastes like battery acid, but their eyes never leave your face while they speak. The rule is deceptively simple, structured like a piece of campfire folklore meant to scare seasonal interns, yet it carries the weight of an absolute commandment. If you are out in the deep backcountry and you stumble upon a campsite that has been abandoned mid-meal, if the freeze-dried food is still simmering over an untended fire, if the tents are wide open and flapping in the wind, if the expensive hiking gear is scattered across the dirt as if the occupants had suddenly evaporated into thin air, you do exactly 3 things. First, you mark the GPS coordinates. Second, you report it to base via your radio. Third, you turn around and you walk away. You do not peer into the dense tree line. You do not call out into the silence. And you absolutely, under any circumstances, do not follow the footprints if they lead off the established trail. I broke all 3 of those rules in a single night. My name is Cole. I spent 4 long, isolating years working as a backcountry patrol ranger at Ashford National Forest, a sprawling, jagged scar of old-growth wilderness nestled into the northernmost corridor of the country. It is a place that most ordinary people have never heard of, a blank spot on the map that I pray they never choose to visit. I am breaking my silence and telling this story now because just last month, the family of the young woman I found out there finally received some semblance of closure. But more importantly, I am telling it because what I discovered alongside her, the thing that was standing perfectly still behind her in the suffocating dark, never made its way into any official report, any police file, or any government record. If you choose to read on, stay with me until the very end. Because the final detail I am going to share with you is the exact reason why I now sleep with every single light on in my house, and why I haven't set foot near a line of trees in over 3 years. I accepted the ranger position when I was 26 years old. I was fresh out of a demanding wildlife biology degree and reeling from a spectacularly toxic breakup that had left my personal life in absolute ruins. At the time, the prospect of spending months on end completely isolated from human contact, buried deep in the absolute wilderness, sounded like a rare paradise rather than a brutal punishment. I wanted to disappear. I wanted a landscape vast enough to swallow my thoughts, and Ashford seemed like the perfect crucible. Ashford was not a glamorous posting. It didn't possess the postcard-perfect vistas of Yosemite or the Instagram-friendly, sun-drenched waterfalls of the Pacific Northwest. There were no paved visitor loops, no souvenir gift shops selling overpriced trail mix, and no paved parking lots for recreational vehicles. Instead, it was 300,000 acres of choked, dense second-growth timber, treacherous granite ridges that sliced into the skyline like broken teeth, and massive, stagnant boglands that seemed to absorb ambient sound like a wet sponge. It was the kind of heavy, oppressive terrain that local residents would willingly drive an hour out of their way just to avoid. It was a place where cellular service died a violent death exactly 8 miles past the main entrance gate and remained entirely dead until you finally crossed back out into civilization. My assigned sector was the northern quadrant, a roughly 60,000-acre expanse of unforgiving wilderness that I shared with only one other ranger. His name was Dennis. Dennis was a weathered 50-year-old mountain of a man who had been patrolling the Ashford backcountry since before I was even old enough to walk. He was a true creature of the woods, a man who communicated almost entirely through low grunts, sharp nods, and deeply meaningful, heavy silences. Dennis knew every single deer trail, every deceptive stream crossing, and every unstable widowmaker tree in the entire sector. He moved through the brush with an uncanny, silent grace that defied his massive frame. But Dennis also harbored a very specific habit that I noticed during my very first week on the trail. He never, under any circumstances, worked past sundown. I don't mean never in the sense that he preferred to be home for dinner. I mean never, as in he had never once, in 22 continuous years of service at Ashford, remained in the backcountry after the sun dipped below the western ridgeline. It didn't matter if an administrative task was left unfinished, or if a minor equipment check was incomplete. When the shadows began to stretch across the forest floor, Dennis would pack his gear with quiet, intense urgency and head straight for the outpost. When I finally gathered the nerve to ask him about it during my second week, we were sitting in the break room. He looked at me for a very long, unblinking moment over the rim of his steaming coffee cup. The silence stretched out until the ticking of the wall clock felt deafening. "Things move differently in these woods at night, Cole," he said, his voice unusually low and gravelly. "Not faster, just differently. It's like they're following a strict set of rules that you haven't had the misfortune of learning yet." I let out a short, nervous laugh, expecting him to crack a smile or wink. He didn't. His expression remained entirely flat, his eyes dead and serious. I should have paid closer attention to that look. I should have asked more questions. But back then, I was 26, arrogant in my academic understanding of nature, and completely blind to the things that hide just beyond the edge of human understanding. The disappearances within the northern quadrant started out small, manifesting in the subtle, easily dismissible ways that these tragedies always seem to begin. The first was a solo hiker who had registered to tackle the Northern Ridge Trail. He was a male in his mid-30s, highly experienced, carrying top-of-the-line navigation gear, and by all accounts a veteran of the backcountry. When he failed to check out at the main gate on his scheduled date, we didn't immediately panic. It was common for hikers to extend their trips or take a wrong turn that delayed them by a day. But by the fourth day of his absence, an official search and rescue operation was launched. We combed the dense ridges for 6 grueling days. On the afternoon of the 6th day, I was the one who found his gear. His internal frame backpack was hanging from a thick hemlock branch, suspended precisely 12 feet off the ground, right in the middle of a section of dense forest that wasn't marked on any official topographical map. There was no tent nearby. There was no sleeping bag laid out. There was absolutely no physical sign of the man himself, no broken twigs, no scuffed dirt, no drops of blood. The backpack itself was entirely undamaged, completely free of the tears or claw marks you would expect from a predatory animal encounter. But the most unsettling detail was inside. When I lowered the pack and opened it, I found his water filter, his emergency personal locator beacon, and his expensive satellite phone resting at the very top. They were perfectly arranged, neatly sorted, and tightly packed, almost as if someone had meticulously gone through his personal belongings and packed them away for him with clinical precision. The official agency explanation pushed to the local media was bare activity, a generic, catch-all excuse that made absolutely zero sense to anyone who actually worked the terrain of Ashford. Bears do not neatly hang heavy backpacks 12 feet up from tree branches. Bears do not carefully sort through delicate emergency electronic equipment and pack them away like military gear. The official report went into a steel file cabinet. The cabinet was locked, and Dennis said absolutely nothing about it. Instead, I watched him quietly adjust his daily routine. He moved his personal end-of-day cutoff from sunset to exactly 45 minutes before sunset. He was shrinking his window of exposure. 6 weeks later, the tension in the office spiked again. A pair of local trail runners, 2 competitive women who were training for an upcoming mountain ultramarathon, reported a deeply bizarre encounter on the high ridge line just above the Ashford Creek crossing. They had been moving at a rapid pace, descending from the high country in the late, golden light of the afternoon, when they both spotted a figure standing completely motionless within the dense trees, roughly 100 yards uphill from the main path. When we interviewed them separately, their descriptions matched with an uncanny, terrifying consistency. They both described the figure as impossibly tall, estimating its height to be somewhere between 7 and 8 feet. It was standing completely still, its unnaturally long arms held slightly away from its gaunt body, as if it were frozen in a state of intense, focused listening. But it was what the entity did next that made the hair on my arm stand up. The moment the 2 women stopped running and locked their eyes directly onto it, The figure didn't turn around to flee into the brush. Instead, it stepped backward. It walked backward into the dark, thick forest, keeping its hidden face oriented toward them the entire time, until the dense shadows of the trees completely swallowed it up. Neither of those women ever set foot in Ashford National Forest again. I dutifully typed up the incident report and handed it to Dennis. He read through it slowly, his eyes tracing the lines of text. Then he folded the paper neatly in half, slipped it into his front shirt pocket, and stared out the window. "It's looking for something," he murmured almost to himself. "What is it, Dennis?" I asked, my voice tight with a frustration that was rapidly turning into genuine fear. "What's out there?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know what it is, Cole, but I know what it does when it finally finds what it's looking for." He paused, turning his hardened eyes back to me. "The backpack in the tree, that wasn't an accident, that was a message." "A message for who?" "For us," Dennis said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "so we'd know it was back." Then came Sarah Kelner. Sarah was 29 years old, a brilliant graduate student who was out in the field studying old-growth lichen colonies for her master's thesis. By all accounts from her university department, she was the most methodical, cautious, and safety-conscious fieldworker they had ever produced. She didn't take risks. She logged her coordinates daily, carried redund ant communication gear, and was camping alone in the deep northern quadrant under a strictly regulated research permit. She had been out there for 11 days when she missed her mandatory weekly check-in call. That happened on a Tuesday in chilly October. By Wednesday morning, the sun had barely cleared the horizon when I hit the trail, heading directly toward her last known campsite. It was a designated wilderness clearing known as Marker 14, a flat, isolated piece of ground near a freshwater spring that researchers favored because the ancient lichen coverage on the surrounding granite outcroppings was unparalleled. I carried my standard-issue radio, my .40 caliber sidearm, and a heavy layer of professional concern that I was actively trying to keep suppressed. I kept telling myself that researchers missing a check-in wasn't an immediate death sentence. Satellite batteries die in the cold. Electronic schedules slip. I had completed this exact welfare check 3 times before in my career, and each time the missing person turned out to be completely fine, just deeply absorbed in their field data and thoroughly embarrassed by the rescue fuss. The autumn morning was bitterly cold and starkly clear. The trail was well maintained for the first 4 miles, but it narrowed significantly as it began its steep climb toward the high rocky ridge. I knew this specific section of the forest intimately. I had walked it probably 200 times over the course of my deployment. Which is precisely why, at the 5-mile mark, I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was profoundly wrong with the trail. It was wider. Not drastically so, maybe 7 or 8 inches of extra clearance on either side of the dirt path. But I had spent enough time in these woods to know exactly where the dirt edge met the first row of wild ferns, where the exposed, twisted root system of a massive hemlock crossed the path, and exactly where the trail curved around a prominent granite boulder. The vegetation along the edges of the trail, on both sides, had been aggressively cleared away. It hadn't been done by a park maintenance crew. I would have seen the work orders on the log board. It had been cleared differently. The thick ferns and brush weren't cut or chopped down by tools. They were pressed completely flat into the dirt. It looked as though something incredibly wide, heavy, and monolithic had dragged itself along the trail, pushing the thick undergrowth down into the earth as it moved. I stood completely still, holding my breath, and listened. The forest was dead quiet. It wasn't the healthy, natural quiet of a wilderness ecosystem. That familiar background hum of songbirds, buzzing insects, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the high canopy. This was something entirely different. This was the heavy, suffocating quality of silence that occurs when every single living organism in an environment has simultaneously made the conscious decision to hold its breath in sheer terror. I reached down and keyed my radio. Nothing came out but a harsh, grating wall of white noise static. I was deep inside a known dead zone, a 2-mile stretch near the high ridge where the towering granite terrain blocked the outpost signal entirely. I knew this territory. I kept walking, the silence ringing in my ears. I smelled the campsite before I actually saw it. It wasn't the foul odor of biological decay, nor was it the sharp, acrid scent of immediate danger. It was the smell of food. Specifically, it was the unmistakable aroma of instant maple oatmeal, still warm, radiating the exact scent it gives off when it has been sitting in a cooking pot for about an hour past its preparation. It is a tiny, horrifyingly domestic detail that I have never been able to purge from my mind. It was the distinct smell of a quiet morning breakfast, abandoned mid-bite. The clearing of marker 14 came into view as I rounded a sharp bend in the trail. The moment I reached the edge of the campsite, my boots froze to the earth. I didn't move for a long time. Sarah's tent was standing perfectly erect. Two collapsible camp chairs were set up near the stone fire ring, angled precisely toward each other, arranged exactly the way you would set them up if you were expecting company to arrive. A small propane camp stove sat on a notched log table, a stainless steel pot resting on top of the burner, the source of the warm smell. A field notebook lay open on one of the canvas chairs, placed face down, as if the writer had merely set it aside for a brief moment to answer a quick question, fully intending to return to the page in seconds. The clearing was completely devoid of life. I immediately fell back on my training protocol. I threw my voice into the trees, shouting her name, identifying myself loudly as a park ranger. I performed a structured perimeter sweep of the immediate area, checking the interior of the tent. Inside, everything was immaculate. Her sleeping bag was unrolled, her advanced research gear was neatly organized, and a clean set of dry clothes was laid out with the meticulous care of someone who had lived out of a backpack long enough to develop an unbreakable system. Everything was there. Sarah Kelner's satellite phone, her emergency rescue beacon, even her car keys, which possessed absolutely no practical utility 7 miles deep into the wilderness, but which she had kept stored safely with her gear anyway, the way city people always do. I walked back over to the camp chair, picked up her open field journal and turned it over. The final entry was dated from that very morning. The handwriting began as careful, elegant, and perfectly even, the disciplined script of a scientist trained to record precise, objective data. But the final 3 lines of text were wildly different. The letters were massive, erratic, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen ball had nearly torn through the page. It was the handwriting of someone whose hands were violently shaking. The last 3 lines read, "It's been standing at the tree line since last night. I've been watching it watch me. I think it's been counting my steps." And then just below that, written in sprawling, desperate letters, "It knows I can see it now." I lowered the notebook, setting it back down onto the canvas chair with trembling hands. I stood up very slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. And then I turned my head to look directly at the tree line. It was standing there. I want to be incredibly precise about how I describe what I saw, because I have recounted this specific sequence of events only 3 times in my entire life. Once to an official search and rescue coordinator, once to a county sheriff, and once to an old friend whom I have since lost touch with. And every single time I try to talk about it, my brain actively attempts to alter the details. It tries to find a normal, mundane category for the entity that simply does not exist in our world. The thing was standing right at the bleeding edge of the dense tree line, perhaps 40 feet away from the center of the campsite. It was impossibly tall. The panicked height estimate provided by the 2 trail runners had been terrifyingly accurate. It stood well over 7 feet tall, perhaps 8, its true height difficult to measure against the towering pines. It was thin. Not humanly thin or emaciated, but an entirely different, grotesque definition of thin. It looked like a creature that had been physically stretched on a rack. It possessed unnaturally long, spindly arms that hung down past its knees, and an elongated, corded neck. Its head was tilted slightly to the right side, mimicking the exact gesture a dog makes when it hears a high-pitched frequency it doesn't quite understand. It was looking directly at me. It wasn't looking at the campsite, nor was it scanning the tent. It was locked onto me specifically with a terrifying intensity that was completely removed from the way a wild animal tracks motion. It was staring at me the way a human being stares at another human being, with absolute recognition. It looked as though it knew exactly who I was. It looked as though it had been waiting for me, specifically, to show up all morning. I couldn't move. I am not even certain that. I was breathing. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between my eyes and that shadow at the edge of the woods. And then the entity moved. It didn't retreat into the safety of the deep forest. It took one slow, highly deliberate, heavy step forward out of the thick brush, planting its foot right at the edge of the clearing, its upper torso still shrouded in partial shadow. As it stepped forward, a sound emanated from it that I had never encountered in all my years of wilderness patrol. It wasn't a vocalization. It wasn't a growl, a screech, or any sound that could be compared to an animal call. It was a rhythmic, incredibly low, pulsing vibration that seemed to vibrate out of somewhere that wasn't quite its chest. It sounded exactly like the deep, heavy hum a high-voltage power line makes during wet weather. A sustained, thrumming electronic pulse that vibrated right through the soles of my boots. Without making a conscious decision, my hand dropped to my hip, unholstered my duty sidearm, and brought it up. The entity stopped the moment the metal clicked. Its elongated head slowly tilted in the opposite direction, and then it spoke. I do not mean that it produced a wild sound that vaguely resembled human speech. I mean that it spoke clear, articulate English words. But the voice didn't sound like it was being naturally produced by vocal cords. It sounded like it was being artificially generated, as if the words were being clumsily assembled, one syllable at a time, pulled from a vast library of recorded human sounds it had meticulously collected over decades. It said she went looking. Every single line of my training, every survival protocol I had ever memorized, and every rational instinct screaming inside my brain told me to back away from that clearing immediately. I should have kept my weapon trained on the entity, retraced my steps down the ridge, reached high ground where my radio function would return, and waited for a heavily armed tactical backup team. I didn't do any of that. Because just as the echoes of that synthetic voice died out, I heard something else coming from the deep forest, far beyond the shadow where the creature stood. I heard a voice. It was distinctly female. It was incredibly faint, muffled by the dense canopy, crying out in a rhythm that wasn't composed of actual words. It was the desperate, ragged vocalization of someone who was completely lost, shouting into the void in the fading hope that another human being might hear them and answer. Sarah Kelner was still alive. She was out there in the thick trees, and the terrifying thing standing between me and the forest was watching me intently as I pieced that realization together. I raised my sidearm higher, aligning the iron sights directly with the center of the creature's elongated chest. I forced my voice to steady itself, projecting it forward with every ounce of authority I could muster. Move. The entity stared down the barrel of the gun. Then it shifted its gaze back to my face. Slowly, without a sound, it took a single step to the side. It didn't retreat into the brush. It merely stepped off the invisible threshold, creating a physical gap between itself and the nearest hemlock tree. It had cleared an opening into the deep woods that was exactly wide enough for a single human being to pass through. It felt exactly like an invitation. I walked right through it. I crossed into the tree line rapidly, keeping my weapon raised and forcing the creature into the absolute edge of my peripheral vision. It didn't attempt to follow me. It simply stood there, its head tracking my movements as I pushed past the thick undergrowth, plunging deeper into the dense brush toward the direction of the female voice. The moment I stepped past the tree line, the light changed drastically. It wasn't dark enough to rationally explain how quickly I completely lost sight of the bright campsite clearing behind me. Economically, I should have been able to see at least a glint of the orange tent or the metallic stove, but within 30 feet of entering the forest, the campsite vanished entirely. There was only forest, dense, suffocating trees in every single direction. I called out Sarah's name. The distant voice stopped instantly. Total, crushing silence. Then from a thicket directly ahead of me and slightly to the left, a whisper broke through the quiet. "Here, I'm right here, don't move until I tell you." Her voice was incredibly steady, but it was the kind of artificial steadiness that costs a person everything to maintain. I had heard that exact tone before during my brief time interacting with military search operations. It was the voice of an individual who had looked into the abyss, decided that panic was a luxury that would get them killed, and physically set their fear aside. I moved toward her whisper with agonizing slowness. Every 3 or 4 steps, I would freeze, holding my breath to listen for the heavy hum of the entity following me through the brush. Nothing. There was only the forest, holding its collective breath around us. I finally found her crouched low behind a massive, moss-covered granite boulder roughly 150 feet from the original clearing. She wasn't physically injured, but she was covered in dark dirt, shivering from the autumn cold, and her eyes were wide and bloodshot from what she later told me was nearly 36 consecutive hours of forced wakefulness. In her left hand, she held a compact headlamp with a rapidly dying, flickering battery. In her right, she tightly gripped a small folding pocket knife, its blade extended. She didn't cry when she saw my Green Ranger uniform. She didn't reach out to hug me. She simply reached up, grabbed the sleeve of my jacket with a vice-like grip, pulled me down into the dirt behind the boulder, and whispered, "How many of them did you see out there?" I swallowed hard. "One." Sarah shook her head slowly, her lips trembling. "There are 3 of them." She had been out in the northern quadrant for 11 days when the anomalies first began to manifest. It hadn't been the entity itself that caught her attention initially. It was the trail. Sarah was conducting her fieldwork in a highly disciplined grid pattern, meticulously marking specific lichen colonies on the granite outcroppings. On the 8th day of her expedition, she had retraced her steps back to a specific sector she had surveyed just 48 hours prior. When she arrived, she found the narrow path she had personally worn through the thick undergrowth was significantly wider than she had left it. It wasn't a minor change. The path had been expanded by a massive margin, as if something incredibly wide and heavy had been deliberately traveling along her exact route the moment she left it. Driven by scientific curiosity, she set up a high-end trail camera trap, the kind wilderness researchers utilize to monitor elusive nocturnal wildlife, and left it active overnight. When she pulled the memory card and reviewed the digital footage the following morning, she found something that defied rational explanation. The camera hadn't failed. The footage ran continuously for the full 12-hour period she had programmed, capturing the subtle background motion of the woods, the wind rustling the ferns, a lone deer passing through the frame. But for a distinct 47-minute block of time between 2:00 a.m. and 2:47 a.m., the footage showed the entire environment falling into absolute terrifying stasis. There was no wind, no movement of leaves, no insects. The entire digital frame was perfectly frozen, as if the physical world itself had been put on a temporary pause. When the normal motion of the forest suddenly resumed at 2:47 a.m. on the video, the trail in the frame was suddenly wider. Whatever had traveled down that path had done so without ever registering on the camera's motion sensor. By the 9th night, Sarah noticed that the acoustic quality of the woods surrounding Marker 14 had fundamentally shifted. The familiar nocturnal sounds, the hooting of owls, the scuttling of small rodents, the wind in the canopy, remained present, but beneath them, vibrating through the earth, was something else. A hum. She described it to me before I could even mention my own encounter, using the exact same phrasing. A low, rhythmic, high-voltage thrumming that felt less like a sound and more like a physical pressure building inside her eardrums. On the 10th night, she saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, exactly where I had encountered it. But instead of fleeing, Sarah made the clinical decision of a trained scientist. She chose to stay put, observe its behavior, and document everything. "I've been recording everything on this," she whispered, holding up a small, rugged digital audio recorder. "I have 12 continuous hours of audio captured from the perimeter, including," she trailed off, staring down at the small plastic device in her hand, "including the moments when it talks." "It spoke to you before today?" I asked. Sarah nodded, her jaw locked tight. "The night before last, I was sitting inside the tent. It came much closer than it ever had before. It walked right up to the very edge of the fire ring, and then it spoke." She closed her eyes. "It said my name, Cole. It said my name perfectly, in my own mother's voice." We remained crouched in the freezing dirt behind that granite boulder for 20 agonizing minutes, while Sarah relayed her observations, and I desperately tried to formulate an escape plan that didn't end with both of us dying in the dark. The core problem was the geography of the sector. The only viable path back to the main trail required us to walk directly back through the clearing of Marker 14, which meant passing within mere feet of wherever that entity was currently waiting. And if Sarah's observations were correct, there were two additional entities hidden somewhere within the surrounding tree line that I hadn't even accounted for. She had formulated a theory. I want to emphasize that it was strictly a scientific theory. Sarah was a researcher, and she presented it strictly as a working hypothesis. But it was the only explanation we had that made any sense of the nightmare we were experiencing. She believed the widened trails weren't an incidental byproduct of the creature's movement. She believed these entities were actively and deliberately expanding their physical territory, utilizing the hiking paths as a defined border system. They were marking them, crushing the vegetation, and widening them in the exact manner a predatory animal establishes a perimeter boundary. And the trail that I had walked in on hours ago, the one that had been crushed flat on both sides, was already fully enclosed within their newly marked zone, which meant that everything I had walked through for the last 2 miles was already inside their territory, which meant they had known I was here from the very moment I entered the dead zone. Sarah also believed, based on her hours of terrified observation, that these things became significantly more active and emboldened when they knew they were being actively watched by human eyes. The act of looking at them, of acknowledging their presence, was somehow incredibly vital to them. The trail runner's bizarre description of the figure walking backward, maintaining unbroken eye contact as it retreated, wasn't an anomaly. It was a core part of whatever rules they operated under. "What does that mean for us right now?" I whispered, checking the cylinder of my sidearm. Sarah stared into the dark woods. "I think it means we don't look back. No matter what we hear, no matter what we feel behind us, we do not look back." We moved. I won't attempt to paint our escape as something heroic or calculated. It was a frantic, terrifying flight. We moved through the dense, choking trees as fast as humanly possible without making enough noise to drown out the sounds of the environment around us. I kept my service weapon extended in front of me. Sarah kept her digital recorder clutched tightly in her hand, its tiny red light bleeding into the dark. Every single time my primitive instincts screamed at me to turn my head and check the shadows behind us, I forced my mind to focus entirely on the sound of our boots hitting the dirt, the ragged rhythm of Sarah's breathing, and finding the straightest line through the brush. When we reached the edge of the campsite clearing, I forced her to a halt. I placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, and we stood shivering at the tree line, peering into the open space of marker 14. The clearing was completely empty. There was absolutely no physical sign of the entity that had been standing there just 30 minutes prior. There was only her nylon tent, the camp chairs, the portable stove, and the cold pot of maple oatmeal, which was now beginning to emit a sour, spoiling odor in the heavy afternoon air. Her field notebook still rested face down on the canvas chair. We bolted through the clearing at a dead sprint. I snatched her heavy fieldwork pack in one hand, kept my sidearm raised in the other, and we didn't slow down for anything. We hit the main dirt trail running. At the 3-mile mark, still running blindly down the mountain ridge, the radio on my chest suddenly erupted with a violent burst of static. The signal had broken through. I slammed my thumb down on the transmission key and managed to gasp out 4 ragged words before my voice completely cracked from the sheer adrenaline. "I have the researcher." We reached the trailhead outpost in just under an hour, collapsing onto the gravel parking lot as the last rays of daylight vanished from the sky. The official administrative debriefing consumed the entirety of the following day. A heavily armed search and rescue team performed a thorough sweep of the marker 14 sector and located the campsite exactly as we had left it. They found absolutely zero physical evidence of large predatory animal activity. There were no tracks or prints left in the cleared, flattened sections of the trail, a highly unusual detail that the investigators noted but ultimately dismissed, attributing it to the exceptionally dry, hard conditions of the autumn soil. Sarah's trail camera trap was successfully recovered from the T. Retrunk, the digital footage from our night of escape contained the exact same 47-minute gap, 2:00 a.m. to 2:47 a.m., the entire forest frozen in time. But when the footage normal rolled forward past the freeze, one of the canvas camp chairs had been physically moved approximately 3 feet away from its original position, turned to face the tent door directly. No official explanation for that detail was ever entered into the final report. Sarah submitted her audio recordings to her university department, and then, as far as I am aware, she never spoke publicly about the incident ever again. I heard through second-hand professional channels that she abruptly abandoned her graduate program, packed her belongings, and moved to an entirely different state across the country. I don't blame her in the slightest. I filed my mandatory incident report 2 days later. I described a young researcher experiencing severe psychological distress and auditory hallucinations brought on by extended solo fieldwork in extreme isolation. I described the mysteriously widened trail as consistent with recent, unlogged volunteer trail maintenance activity. I described the towering, 7-foot entity at the tree line as a large, mature ungulate observed at a significant distance in deeply poor lighting conditions. Every single word I typed into that document was a blatant lie. But it was the only version of the report that was going to result in a standard filing, rather than an immediate mandatory psychiatric evaluation and a permanent termination note in my personnel file. Dennis read through my completed report in silence. He set the pages down on his desk, remaining perfectly still for about a minute. Then, without looking up, he said, "You saw it." It wasn't a question. "It spoke, Dennis," I said, my voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, his expression heavy, as if I had just confirmed a piece of information he had been grimly anticipating for decades. "Dennis," I pleaded, leaning over his desk, "what the hell are they?" He slowly turned his head to look out the office window. From our desks, the distant tree line of Ashford was clearly visible, looming roughly a quarter-mile away under the gray sky. He stared at those trees the way a man stares at a terminal diagnosis, something he had lived alongside his entire life without ever being able to truly change. "I don't know what they are, Cole," he said quietly, "but I know they've always been out there, long before we built these trails, long before we paved these roads, long before our kind ever arrived here." He paused, his eyes reflecting the dark green of the forest. "The wilderness doesn't belong to us, son. We just built flimsy little paths through it, and they've been standing in the dark watching us do it." He picked up his faded coffee cup, his hand completely steady. "They're patient," he murmured. "That's the part that really gets to you. They are very, very patient." I handed in my official resignation 2 weeks later. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't lace up my boots and walk those isolated trails knowing what I knew about the things that claimed them the moment the sun dipped below the ridge. Some thresholds, once you cross them, alter your perception so deeply that you can never go back to the world you knew before. I moved as far away from the wilderness as my savings would allow. I rented a small, 4th-floor apartment in the heart of a massive concrete city. It is an environment of glass, steel, and asphalt in every single direction. It is the exact kind of sterile place where the only trees are ornamental saplings trapped in concrete planters, and where you can see for 3 blocks in every direction under the harsh glare of neon signs. For 8 months the plan worked. I slept perfectly fine. Then on a freezing night in February, I woke up at exactly 2:00 a.m. for absolutely no discernible reason. My eyes simply snapped wide open, leaving me staring at the plaster ceiling, completely awake. I lay there in the quiet for a few moments, listening to the familiar, comforting acoustic tapestry of the city, the distant rumble of highway traffic, a far-off police siren, the steady hum of my building's HVAC system. But then, underneath all of it, a vibration began to build in my ears. It was rhythmic, it was incredibly low. It wasn't the building pipes and it wasn't urban traffic. It was that distinct, high-voltage hum. I threw off my blankets, got out of bed, and walked over to the glass window. I pressed my forehead against the cold pane and looked down at the empty city street 4 stories below. There was nothing there. The sidewalk was completely deserted, illuminated by the harsh orange glow of the streetlights. The 2 small ornamental trees in their concrete planters stood perfectly still, their branches bare from the winter frost. I stood at that window for a very long time, staring down until my legs began to ache and I started to feel utterly foolish. I began to lecture myself, telling my brain that it was just the apartment heating system, old city infrastructure, or a phantom echo of my past trauma filtering mundane noise into a nightmare. I was almost entirely convinced. I actually smiled, preparing to turn around and walk back to bed. Then, one of the bare ornamental trees down on the sidewalk moved. It wasn't the wind. The air was dead calm, and the second tree just 5 feet away remained perfectly, absolutely still. This tree moved with an agonizing, slow, heavy shift, one main branch bending down drastically, exactly the way a thick branch moves when something incredibly large and heavy has been resting its weight upon it, and has just quietly lifted itself away into the dark. The branch bounced slightly, then went completely still. I stood at that glass window until the sun finally broke over the city skyline. I haven't slept with the lights off a single night since,